Good afternoon. Welcome to our second performance research seminar. Turn the sound up here. Sound button on the right. And as you probably know from our announcements, the series is broadcast live to dancetechNet. We're co-producing it together with our friends in New York. And so the lecture will be available online in the archive. And our special guest today from Madrid, JAIME DEL VAL. We're very pleased to have you here, JAIME. And he's artist in residence this week. So very fortunate for us, he could stay for 3 days. And yesterday already taught a master class over in the Arto Center, introducing us to his work and his ideas, but also allowing some of you who came to test some of the exploratory, choreography of microdance, microsex in action. And your topic today, JAIME, is microsexes, microdances, meta-human technologies, undoing anatomy in capitalism of affects. And introducing him is a great pleasure. He's a long-term colleague in the dance and performance field, but also activist, writer, composer, and media artist, has his own institute, the Institute for Meta-Human Technologies in Madrid. And I've asked him to introduce some of his conceptual worlds to us, as well as perhaps show some of your work and maybe report also from the front lines of your activism, as he is involved in a number of issues dealing with sexuality, gender, and identities, meta-identities, and new formations. Yeah? So please welcome JAIME DEL VAL.
Thank you, Johannes. It's a great honor to be here. I will maybe go through some of the things that we saw already, some of you saw yesterday, but also maybe show some other things that you did not quite see. I would like to talk about some of the projects in which I approach how to redefine our modalities of relation, which is what metahumanism is about. So whenever I use the prefix meta in all I'm going to say, please be aware that I don't use it only in the sense of coming after, but in the sense of in between, which is the other meaning that it had in ancient Greek. So meta is as in between as across. So it's about rethinking relationalities. It's about rethinking ourselves in terms of relational processes, of rethinking actually the body as a relational process rather than as a materiality. It's about rethinking the whole sets of distances, exteriorities, and frontiers that we are normally assuming in our Cartesian and rationalistic society. In fact, the frontiers and distances that media technologies are reproducing all the time. For instance, if you think of the notion of interface, it's one, according to Catherine Hales and other such theorists, which is reproducing such divides between the object and the subject, between the rational mind and the body, that these interfaces try to permanently erase. So interface is something that mediates between the body, the face that represents the abstract mind of the rational subject and the machine, not between the body and the machine. And this is a very significant question, because we have a very pervasive and I think problematic attempt of erasure of corporeality in media culture in general. So rethinking interfaces, rethinking relational processes at every scale, rethinking how all of this is a very significant or crucial question within contemporary regimes of power, where I think that implicit power operates mostly or very significantly in terms of trying to give form to our affects and desires. Therefore, the relational question is very significant there, to see how this is working. How is it that our affects and desires are being shaped? We normally tend to think that, because we assume the humanistic tradition of a free will, that affects and desires are some things that come out from the depths of this humanistic subject, which is supposed to be autonomous, which is supposed to be superior due to its rationality to other species. So a number of paradigms of humanism that have been intensively questioned within streams of critical posthumanism, for instance. So how do all these, how can we review all these in terms of understanding affect not as something given, not as something that comes out of who knows where, but as something that is produced within specific frameworks? How can we think these affects, these processes of affective production, if we think that affects and desires are produced in certain manners, how does this happen? Well, one of the ways in which I am interested in thinking about this is precisely in choreographic terms, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this in this context. So what are affects? After all, affects is not the same, as we were saying yesterday, not the same as emotions or feelings. Affect is a broader concept, such as I am proposing it in a Spinozian tradition. So affect is in fact any force that affects or is affected. We could in fact understand the whole of reality in terms of affects, of forces that affect and are affected, from the molecular to the social to other scales. So then emotions and feelings are more precise domains of affects that we usually associate to a human subject. So they are intelligible affects through which we identify a human subject. But affect is a much broader, has a much broader connotation. So if we think of affects as relational forces, forces that affect and are affected, could we perhaps think of these in choreographic terms? Which are the movements of these relational forces? So my suggestion is that affects are disseminated in every occasion in which any kind of choreography in a very broad sense is disseminated as well. So for instance, when we are using our interfaces relating to computers or video games or mobile phones or whatever, we are doing there little movements, little choreographies. We are of course mostly not aware of these as choreographies or as performances of any kind, but just try to think of them as such. When you're looking at moving images, let's say Hollywood films, to think of a very standardized kind of industry that reproduces very standardized choreographies of affect also. Well, how is it that you are embodying also, well, the affective choreographies that are distributed by those moving images? When we are immersed in this permanent field of ubiquitous commercial music, which is almost inescapable at least in metropolitan zones of capitalist societies, how is it also that this ubiquitous commercial music is distributing standardized choreographies of affects in the bodies, and so on and so forth. So we can have a broad approach to the notion of movement and of choreography in order to see how relational forces are interacting there in the distribution of standardized affects. I think for me this is a very crucial political question, because I think that is where mostly, or that is at least a very significant stratum in which, or through which power is operating, or through which we are being permanently assimilated into specific regimes of production and consumption, which, because they work at the at the level of affective production, not at an ideological level or at a rational level, is something that we hardly resist. So it's a very powerful mechanism of assimilation, in a way. So all of these technologies which are distributing global choreographies of affect is what I call the pan-choreographic. In fact, it's an unlimited set of technologies. We could always amplify or extend the list, so to speak. It's not only relating media, culture, technologies, but also other older technologies. So in fact, I think it's important always to bear in mind, or to have in mind, a very broad sense of technology. So technology is any procedure that is structuring our modes of relationality or our lives in any broad sense. So for instance, architecture, writing, language, dance, music, furniture, tables and chairs are fundamental technologies for the, structuring of the humanist subject. Whatever, I prefer to stand rather than sit. I feel rather uncomfortable if I would if I would talk to you sitting here behind a table. It's as if I cut off my body all of a sudden, and it's a rational head talking to other rational heads who are sitting as spectators. So we still have a bit of a distance, which makes me a bit uncomfortable. Normally I don't like to have this kind of spectacular distance if I'm talking to someone, because I think that we are relational bodies. It's not about minds talking to one another through positioning oneself as exterior to one another, but rather we are also in this context, putting into motion these relational choreographies of affect in some way. So we are constituting here a kind of relational body. So relational bodies are not to be confused with what we normally call an individual human body or animal body or whatever, but are fields of relational forces. Meta-bodies are fields of relational forces, and these are always exceeding individual bodies, but at the same time they are constitutive of what we call or identify as individual bodies. So, a question would be, what kind of meta-body are we constituting here? Of course, we could start analyzing some rather visible elements. Well, we have a certain architecture, as I said, a certain distance. You are sitting there listening, I'm standing and talking, and so on. But apart from that, I suggest that this particular meta-body, like any meta-body, would be impossible to map, because I can't possibly know how each of you is embodying the affects in a very specific and broad sense at the same time that I am disseminating, or how these forces, these relational forces, are proliferating even in this very specific circumstance. Even less, of course, if we go out there. And so relational bodies or meta-bodies, I think, are never reducible to any kind of cartography. And this is again a very important issue, because if we think that, if we realize that in media culture, in information society, in contemporary global capitalism, it's all mostly about mapping reality, about subjecting reality to control, about reducing reality to maps and cartographies that we can then control, which of course is part of a very long history of colonizations. It's a history of centuries of a humanistic tradition that has attempted to subject the world to control, of course from the point of view of a very specific hegemonic subject, a Western European, normally male, middle, high class, etc. subject. So we have this humanistic history of control. Now, how has this history been articulated in a way? Because it relies, I think, upon certain conditions of possibility. One which I am very interested in researching is what are the actual conditions of possibility of positioning oneself outside a reality to make maps out of it. Because if you are not exterior to something, you can't have a view of it so as to make a map out of that reality and subject it to some kind of control or another. So how is it that we tend to think that we can see something from an outside and map it and subject it to control? We assume this position normally, but is it really something that we can take for granted, or what are the conditions of possibility of such a perspective and position? I think that one significant genealogy of this we can trace in what I would call the genealogies of perception. So how is it that perception is articulated in such a way that we pretend to be outside an objective reality as a rational mind who can observe it from this distance? I think this particular history, which I mentioned yesterday already, has to do with how, at least with how the camera as a technology has been used since the 15th century, when painters started to use it to produce a realistic style of painting. Of course, not the camera, but the camera obscura, which was an earlier kind of version, so to speak, of the photographic camera, which was this dark room in which through a lens the exterior image was projected inverted on a wall so that the painter could draw it in a precise manner. How since then specific ways of using the technology of the camera in terms of fixed framing, distance, exposure, focus, and a number of other parameters has become in a way the condition of possibility for an objective view of the world, and therefore also for constituting a subjectivity that is looking onto that objective world. So I suggest that really if we would not have this fixed framing, this distance, this focus, this exposure, and this number of ways of looking onto the world, we would not have this divide between subject and object. So this Cartesian divide has been specifically and technologically construed. And we are now immersed in a society which is exponentially multiplying this divide through this ubiquitous proliferation of screens, cameras, and so on. For which reason I think that in fact every camera is potentially a surveillance camera, and in fact mostly it is acting as such. So even when you are taking, your little family picture, posing for it in whatever funny way, or as a tourist in the city, even there you are assimilating, or we are assimilating ourselves, whenever we all do it, in a certain specific regime of representation in which we are again assuming these distances, these framings. So then you say, if the picture wasn't in the right frame, you say, well, it was a wrong picture, let's repeat it again. So you're there trying to reproduce, or one assumes a certain kind of normative or standardized form of representing this apparently objective reality. What happens if we do away with all these parameters of how we use the cameras altogether? What happens if we use these cameras in such a way that we have no longer distance, fixed framing, focus, or whatever other kinds of parameters? Can this fiction of the subject-object divide sustain in such a case? And what are the consequences of dissolving those boundaries? Well, of course, these are open questions, but I will try to show you how I have dealt with some of them, just as little examples of how one can work through these constructs, in this case of perception itself. So in my work I'm mostly interested not so much in rethinking contents, so what happens inside the screen, inside this framing, but in undoing the framing itself. Of course, now we have a frame here, so it's a bit problematic, but mostly I try to do away with it. And so that opens up a whole different field of possibilities then, which is no longer about changing the contents of the frame. And if you undo the frame, then you can put into motion an entirely, or many entirely new ways of relating to the world, and therefore of becoming, because what we are as a process of becoming has to do with all these relational processes, and is in fact inseparable from them. So this is what I basically try to approach when I'm talking about meta-human technologies. It's about technologies through which we are reappropriating, redefining the modes of relationality through which we are what we are, or we eventually become something other. So again, this is, I think, something significant or politically relevant in what I call capitalism of affects, which is, as I mentioned before, this current derive or development of capitalism in the last decades towards an increase in the technologies that are attempting to give form to our affects and desires. And so my particular proposal in this regard is, well, if we transform all these perspectives, all these ways in which perception is structured, what happens with the traditional ways of recognizing the world that we normally work with? Normally we recognize this objective world in terms of form. Form which relates to an identity. This is what mostly happens, especially in urban areas or in, well, in certain social milieus. Of course, it's not the case if you're maybe walking in the forest or looking at a sunset or sitting in front of the sea. Maybe there you're not trying to identify a form. Of course, some people will, but if you're walking in the city, if you're going to work, if you're embedded in certain economic regimes which are demanding from you to recognize identities and to show yourself in terms of an identity and a recognizable form, then of course it's difficult sometimes to avoid that. And it often becomes a problem because identities and forms are never quite as plural as we would like them to be, because they usually tend to obey or reproduce certain normative regimes or certain normative regimes about what an acceptable form or an acceptable identity is supposed to be. Whereas, of course, reality is, I think, emergent and in constant transformation, so permanently new potential identities and forms are emerging there. But often many of these are, so to speak, cast away into the realm of the unspeakable, if we quote Judith Butler in this respect. So how can we operate on the limits of form, of the recognizable, of the intelligible, of the acceptable? Because of course this is an important relation, how the intelligible counts as the acceptable and how the unintelligible or the nearly intelligible is often cast away as the abject. Of course we will link this later to issues of politics around sexuality and many other issues as well we could link it to. So one reaction to this problem in past decades has been to play around with identity in performative and performatic manners, like in queer politics, for instance. Now, much as I do appreciate those politics very much, and I practice them as well, my particular interest in this field of experimentation is a different one. It's not so much about playing around with identity, parody with performative reiterations or subversive reinscriptions of identity, but what happens, I mean, could we eventually do away with identity altogether? Or in fact, do we already operate outside the fields of identity production and form recognition in many aspects of our life that we tend to ignore? This would be another question. And then, of course, how could we, or if that's an interesting kind of field that we would like to explore, how could we strengthen or deepen into the unintelligible, the amorphous fields of our being, of our becoming, of our being in the world? Well, I think this can be done in many ways. In fact, I think there are some very interesting and older traditions that have dealt with this, like maybe Buddha or Buddhism, or things which I have personally not yet really explored very much, so I won't talk about these much as I'm interested in them, and I hope to study them deeper. But I think this can be developed in infinite variety of ways. So I have developed my own little techniques for this, for a becoming amorphous, for a becoming which doesn't rely permanently on a reproduction of recognizable forms that are framed within specific interpretation frameworks. Of course, I don't pretend now, I'm not thinking in utopian terms, I'm always thinking much more in terms of a politics of resistance within this society obsessed with identity and form, of control and surveillance, of visualization and mapping. So how do we resist this obsession of control through producing the permanently amorphous. So how can this be a politics that we add onto other kinds of politics, not substituting other kinds of politics, but adding onto them within a radically pluralist framework? Well, I think this, as I say, there are many ways of doing it. So I've explored this in several different projects and in several different ways. Now, I will start going through the Microdances, Microsexes project that we saw yesterday already, and then I will try to show some other projects that deal with this. Well, just let me see if we have the internet connection now. Oh, well, actually, I will start with a video. So the Microdances, Microsexes project, so it started, the name of the project was at the start Microdances, then it evolved into Microsexes, is one such project in which I am trying to reappropriate the technology of surveillance par excellence, which is the surveillance camera. Although I think there are much more perverse nowadays technologies of control like Facebook and social networks and so on. We can talk about these later. Of course, I must say that all of this was not the start of the project there. It's not that this is a project that was trying to explain something or develop a philosophical idea. The theory emerged along the way with a project in feedback between theory and practice, because I do both. I do philosophy and I do multidisciplinary arts practices, and I do then also activism. So all of these elements were intertwined in the process, but what I came up with somehow after a while was something like this, where it's an ongoing work in progress, really. It's something I will continue to work on. I've developed it in several different kinds of formats. But the basic idea is how these little surveillance cameras are placed anywhere on the body, which is what some people here could try yesterday in the workshop. And so suddenly these little cameras that are looking onto the skin, which is directly in contact with them, which are being, the image of which is being projected live, how these cameras become the eyes of the body in a way. So perception is transposed, visual perception in this case, but now this affects all forms of perception, is transposed from the face of the subject, from this fixed framing where the eyes are fixed in the face, and normally the camera is used as an extension and even a strengthening of this fixity of perception, how this is suddenly transposed somewhere else, where because these eyes are no longer in the face of the subject, because they don't have any more an exterior or a condition of distance and exteriority towards what they see, because their framing is in constant movement, because the focus is blurred, because of a whole set of issues which I mentioned before, you don't have possibly any longer the conditions of possibility on which this subject-object divide is based. So suddenly the body is entering a different mode of relationality with itself, if you want to call it, and therefore also possibly with other bodies and with the world. Let's see some little videos. And then we can continue talking about the implications of this. What you will hear is only, it's another significant element of the project, in fact of all the projects I've been doing in the realm of dance technology or performance and technology. It's also the sound, because I'm also a musician, and so what you will hear is only the live processing of the voice. There's no pre-recorded material, but we can talk about it after you've seen a bit of it. So some of you have already seen it, but we will just go through it a bit quicker than yesterday, and then we see some other projects as well which have a very completely different approach to meta-human technologies. Oh, sorry. So the body moves through what it sees. If you see, in this case myself, I'm looking there constantly at the screen. In this case, one could also use virtual glasses, for instance. But it's as if the cameras have become the eyes of the body. So you move, the body moves through what it sees in these projected images, which are actually the moving, the microdances of the body, these amorphous landscapes So I wear different cameras in different places, and I can swap from one to the other during the performance. We'll continue talking as we see the video. So what happens when the body doesn't have an exterior view to itself? When it is a permanently amorphous kind of vision, which in fact is not about having multiple perspectives, but about having a lack of perspective, a lack of distance. Now, presumably one of the things that I think may happen is that anatomy as a regime of control of the bodies cannot be successfully reproduced, because precisely you don't have the exterior perspective that allows you to map a body in particular manners. This can become especially relevant in relation to certain issues. For example, if we want to undertake a critique of how binary gender and sex constructions are reproduced. I'm referring to the male-female or man-woman binary. But we could extend this, of course, to other kinds of binaries regarding sexual orientation or many other kinds of issues regarding sexuality. Well, one of the roots of this divide, which becomes somewhat problematic at times, is in the reductionism of sexuality to genitals and of these to heterosexual reproduction, which is the way in which the medical legal system mostly categorizes the bodies of a newborn person in order to assign a binary gender sex onto it. If we would agree that sexuality is not to be reduced neither to genitals nor to reproduction, then this binary imposition of an identity is quite arbitrary and questionable, which is the reason why anybody, not only transgender people and intersexuals, could legitimately reject such a category. This is something I might talk about later or tomorrow. I am now promoting a gender strike, so in which anybody can legitimately reject binary gender categories. I, for example, I'm of course doing the gender strike, so I consider myself neither a woman nor a man. I'm also doing a species strike, so I don't consider myself human either, because again I think that the divide between the human and the non-human is somewhat arbitrary, which is of course something that has been extensively criticized by post-humanist critique. We can talk about these issues later more in detail if some of you are more interested in any of these topics. So, you know, what is happening there? Could you identify this as an intimate interaction? Could you identify this as a sexual interaction? Or is it not entirely reducible to any of those frameworks of interpretation? I don't know. Maybe each of you has a different way of perceiving this, but I am certainly not interested in producing here something that is immediately reducible to an interpretation, but rather something that is permanently opening up the potential fields of interpretation. So not only the sexual morphology of the body is put into question, since we don't have a body, at least in the projected image and in the way the body perceives itself, a body reducible to forms, to anatomical forms, to anatomical morphologies. It's a permanently amorphous body, a body in movement, a body in motion, a relational body, but never reducible to morphologies. But of course, this also has an effect on not only binary gender-sex constructs, but also the definition of sex in itself. If you don't quite recognize what kind of body that is, sometimes it doesn't even look human or even animal. Sometimes it's organic or mechanic, or it can be anything. Then whatever it is doing is never entirely clear either. So, but since we have a skin, since we have sometimes bodies in contact, since we have, well, we are operating, I think, on boundaries of the intelligible and eventually opening them up onto something else. So for me, the skin here is what maybe acts as a boundary of the legible, of the intelligible. If we would, for example, process this image with video effects and it would become a completely neutral visual effect, then I think we would lose this boundary of negotiation of the body and its frameworks of legibility. Sorry. Let's show another version, another format of this, which also I showed yesterday, but anyway. This is more of a street intervention. You can leave the lights down if you want. So then if it's not entirely clear what this body can mean, what its interactions are potentially meaning, then also the limits of sex are eventually put into question. I mean, is any of what you is any of what you've seen sexual or pornographic? Could it be? Or if we would perform some more explicit actions but still reframe them in this perceptual framework, what would they be? I think it's interesting to pose oneself the questions of what recognizable morphologies of the body are, where they start, where they begin, where they end, especially those that are socially problematic. For example, well, genitals, which are so obsessively condemned in our sexophobic societies for whatever arbitrary reasons that I have never been able to understand. Well, if you start to question yourself, where do actually these organs, these morphologies start? Where do they end? You know, it's an interesting question because it's never entirely clear to me. And if you undo the morphology, then it's even more open to further renegotiations of these bodily boundaries of social norms. But also not only regarding the morphology, but the action, the activity. So sex as an activity. What are its boundaries? What are the choreographies of sex, the intelligible choreographies of sex, those that are so pervasively condemned, once again, by sexophobic society? What if we operate in those boundaries? What if we start doing what I call in other projects, something this one you will see later, alien couplings of bodies? So, you know, if we start, for example, putting our elbows together and, you know, working on that for a while, you know, here in a circle, would that be group sex, you know? So how do we structure these zones of intelligibility that become so heavily loaded very often? So in this project, the techniques is the same mostly, only I'm wearing the projector as well, and I project on significant buildings that are like symbols of power of the social body. So on these symbols of, on these architectures of power of the social body, I project the amorphous, ephemeral architectures of the post-anatomical body. But again, in this project, it's the most important thing is always more what the body is experiencing than whatever one can perceive as a spectator from an outside. That's the reason why I refer to these projects as metaformances rather than performances. Of course, I do have a performatic element too, but I'm trying to do away with that part. Metaformances, again, is about processes of redefining relationality. Performance and the spectacular normally, well, it can, of course, redefine relationality, but it's not so directly concerned with that. And often it reinstates given modes of relationality. So when you reinstate a spectacular paradigm, even, you know, here, as I was saying with this divide, well, you are reinstating also a modality of relations there, which is normally highly structured and hierarchical and something that I, for example, would not necessarily be interested in reproducing. Whereas metaformance is about dealing precisely with whatever kinds of relational processes. So it's more about what the body is experiencing and maybe how the relation also to other bodies then is transformed than about looking at this from an outside as a spectator. This is why I'm evolving more and more into formats in which the spectator disappears completely or almost completely. So, for example, intimate encounters with the audience where people come one after the other for 5 minutes, just an intimate encounter with a person in a smaller room, or even doing it in private houses, or through the internet via Skype, but showing the microdances and the processed voice instead of the usual kind of interaction. So, in such a way that the persons involved are really feeling part of this process rather than external spectators of it. How are we doing with time? Let's see, how are we doing with time? Okay, we have 10 more minutes. I think I will now give you a quick view of other very different approaches to metaformance and to this redefinition of relational technologies. By the way, Microsexes, as you may have or maybe not noticed, refers to the infinite potential sexes of a body that has no identifiable form. So all these microdances, the micro movements of this permanently amorphous body, are the microsexes, the potential sexes that never actualize, that never become defined. Let's see. Or no, first devisualize. So the devisualize call for projects, we had this year 5 very interesting projects by different artists from various countries like Brazil, the US, France and Spain. Oh no, sorry. In which various different approaches to this notion of devisualization were put into practice. For instance, one of the artists, Zach Blas from LA, Los Angeles, did a project on biometrics and facial recognition, which is one of the major topics of control society nowadays. It has been so for decades, actually. So how to identify certain patterns of identity or of behavior through facial recognition. Of course, the usual target of such programs, of such projects, is very similar to the target of the Bush administration in its quest for conquering the world, so things like terrorists. But not only, there are also there are also projects for fag face recognition. So what does a fag face look like? What if you are a fag and a terrorist, like maybe myself? So he did like a project in which he was blending multiple faces of terrorists and of fags together into a 3D mask that was printable and that one can wear to wear, you know, in front of facial recognition systems anywhere in the world. So you can wear actually a mask that is putting together and blending multiple faces of terrorists and of fags. And so, you know, as a weapon, so to speak, against these facial recognition and control and surveillances. Just to give you an example of, you know, how varied these projects can be. Okay, let's let's show you this other project. Now, this is a project I did last year. I started last year because we hope to continue it with a colleague from Chile. I was there in 3 weeks. I went there for other purposes, but we decided we wanted to do something together. We had met in another trip I had done there. So we took the opportunity of my stay there throughout 3 weeks to develop something like a residency. So I stayed in his house, and so we used this whole period as an intensive kind of collaboration or residence development. So the original idea in this project was, well, Sergio, which is the other artist, wanted to work on identity. Okay, the national identity also, not only sexual identity. So I proposed him, well, let's start by challenging the traditional identity relations between Chile and Spain. And so I will go there as a Spanish, the Spanish colonizer is a very typical kind of figure inherited from colonial periods, and still it's going on actually. So all the major Spanish companies are still conquering Latin America, like Telefonica, Endesa for the water, and so it's really still happening in a very heavy and problematic manner. So, well, I told him, well, let's start with a parodic subversion of this figure of the Spanish colonizer. So I told him, I will be for 3 weeks your sexual slave and your prostitute, and we will transmit live from your house and in public spaces whatever actions we perform starting from this framework. Well, of course he rejected this, unfortunately. He wasn't willing to be my master or my, how do you say, proxeneta? Well, so I had to advertise myself in the sex workers' websites of Santiago de Chile, which was quite successful actually. But we continued developing from that framework, which was like a pre-contract. And we started developing the idea, also always with having in mind how to produce unintelligible affects within the relation that we were establishing, or the relationality that we were establishing throughout this 3-week period in which we were working and living together. So the production of illegible affects was, in a way, the concern in this respect, which is another way of approaching the amorphous, in a way. How can we think of producing affects that are not fully intelligible as human emotions, and that we don't want to make intelligible in any kind of way? Affects that are challenging our traditional manners of differentiating modes of relationality. So we explored some of the possibilities for these, and so the production process was quite funny, because we improvised all sorts of things, from filming porn in the house to whatever, but always involving some kind of post-human sex in between, or sleeping together, where of course we were not a couple or anything like that, or didn't have a relationship. It was part of an affective exploration, really, of how, starting from certain frameworks, we could set to motion. Oh, this video has been deleted because it was too pornographic, I'm sorry. But so yeah, fluid discontrol, alien menstruations, all these were just improvisations. Of course, also some more usual kinds of couplings, and then the production of I don't know what you call it in English, like these products for marketing products. So we started thinking of ourselves as dysfunctional operating systems that were generating a software of affective discontrol in a process of disadaptation between one another. Of course, this software was a bodily software, a choreographic software of affective discontrol. Of course, this is a whole parody of, software is never bodily, or never considered to be such, although I think this should be seriously rethought. Software is usually for the purpose of controlling things, not of discontrolling them. So here we have, of course, the contrary. And so throughout this period of production, we arrived to the production of this software called Heiser, from Jaime and Sergio, Heiser 1.0. This is the first version of the software. We hope to develop now new versions of it. So we actually came to present and install this software towards the end of the process. So if you enter here the site, it's still, I'm afraid, only in Spanish. We are hoping to translate it soon. We did the installation. Now this happened in a museum, in the Contemporary Art Museum in Chile. There was this interesting exhibition called SLC 2110, which was about architecture projects, but done by people who are in the limits between architecture and performance, like Vito Acconci, for 100 years ahead, so for 2110. And so what we did was actually an intervention in this exhibition. We installed ourselves choreographically in the exhibition, making, of course, a parody of all the beautiful concepts for the future that were being proposed in the exhibition. So our software, Heiser 1.0, was in a way proposing also a meta-human for 2110, but of course in a beta version full of mistakes and errors and whatever you call this. So this was again also a bit of a parody of all these future projects for the city. We were also doing a project for a future human, but it was all full of things that didn't work. And the first thing that didn't work, of course, was our software of discontrol. We were attempting to set to motion these unintelligible affects, but in the process we would see how, for example, viruses of romanticism could emerge, or on the contrary, viruses of emotional blockage, would you say, or barriers, or things like that. So we incorporated all this into the process, and so the installation was was very funny. We did these alien couplings like I showed before, with these elbows together, but in a more complex manner. We improvised these into each of the installations of these famous artists, architects like Vito Acconci and so on. So, for example, if the Vito Acconci exhibition was had certain concepts attached to it, well, we transformed this and we said, well, the coupling is body and the choreography is what he was proposing, spaces of encounter and public manifestations. This was the choreography performed in the installation of Vito Acconci. So this was an hours-long, let's say, well, yeah, 4 or 5 hours long performance in which we did the installation of this bodily software in the exhibition in the museum. And the following day we did the demo of the software, which was a more like 40 minutes performance, in which Sergio and me were dressed like you see here in the pictures, like members of a corporation, mixed of corporation and laboratory. So in a very code manner we were expressing, we had built, of course, the logo for the company and so on. We were explaining the license of the software, which is a parody of Adobe Photoshop, the installation we had the previous day, and the production process, and so on and so forth. And then towards the end, it was very funny because we performed this in a space of the exhibition that was the hub of Rosalie Goldberg. So Rosalie Goldberg had a specific space there in the museum where people could present performance projects. And of course Sergio did a parody of Rosalie Goldberg. This is Bruce Lee Goldberg, who was presenting the biography of Heiser, this meta-human artist of the future. But in the end, then, of course, you see we had a little laboratory here where we were mixing some things that we then offered to the public as a marketing product for the software. We were mixing them here during the conference. And in the end, we offered to the public these little boxes, which are the demo. Now, what these boxes contain is actually mixed of Sergio's and my own semen, you call it, semen? Yeah, which we had produced throughout these days before the presentation. This is of course a little homage to Piero Manzoni, but in this case it's not shit, it's not artist shit, but it's a mix of artist semen. It's not only criticizing the arts market but also software corporations and many other things. So again, this project, how is metaformance really defined in this process? Well, the key issue in this project was the actual relational process that Sergio and myself were developing throughout the 3 weeks, and how this gave birth actually to monstrous, illegible kinds of affects. In fact, one of the questions that people asked themselves apparently after we did the final performance was whether we had been lovers or we had had a relationship or something, because, and of course, well, it was not the case. So people found it terrifying, apparently, that we were presenting in such a cold manner this whole process of emotional working around frontiers and involvement and disinvolvement outside the context of a relationship, so-called relationship, but in the context of our relationality. So we were really dealing at the theme of this metaformance was the actual reworking of relationalities and of affects, trying to open these up to unintelligible fields. Of course, this again failed because we were a beta version. We were not the final product. So we want to continue developing this software, and maybe for the next call we will invite other bodies to join us in the process. So I will hopefully launch the call. So there are many other things I could talk about, but I think we are out of time. There are other projects I've done which have completely different approaches to this, which are more maybe in a tradition of dance and technology, where I've used interactive systems for capturing movement and transforming interactive environments and so on and so forth, even telematically, as I did in part of a European project in which we were connecting 4 cities to generate a collective interactive environment where we were sending the data of interaction. This was also in a way, and we tried there I, from my group in Madrid, tried to pursue accounts of presence without identity, amorphous presence in telematics. So there are many ways of approaching these ideas that I've presented to you. I just wanted to show you at least 2 which are very different. And so maybe if you want, we can start now a little debate, and you can ask or questions or throw ideas or whatever you may want to do, or maybe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yes, I think we definitely would like to have a post discussion, so we'll open the floor. And please bring your questions. And just one footnote about yesterday. You mentioned the experience of working with the surveillance cameras. Some of you were there yesterday, and I think it was interesting for me to note that the spectating is one thing, but the actual work with the camera and the immersive experience in this experiment with the body is another thing. Perhaps some of you who have explored it yesterday over a sustained 10, 15, 20-minute period, you're welcome to comment on what it was like for you, because that will be interesting for the other students to hear. But let's open the floor, and please questions and comments to Jaime. Bordovic.
Thank you very much. A very, very interesting talk. I was just going to go back to the title of the talk and the words capitalism of affects, which immediately reminds me of Christian Marazzi. I don't know if you were thinking of but his work on financial capitalism, he uses the same title of capitalism of affects.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But interestingly,
you must tell me.
His sort of major contribution to that political economy is the idea of language producing certain economic structures. So I was wondering, because I thought there was a connection in the talk, and then I was wondering what the role of language plays in the work that you're doing, especially with regards to
that's an interesting question, because actually I'm interested in redefining the conception of language altogether. I think actually of language in non-verbal terms. I think that we can rethink language in terms of choreographies, of verbal movements of choreographies of writing. I don't believe in meaning, really. I don't think that I'm producing meaning here for you. I think that I'm disseminating affects, very specific, discrete affects that each of you is embodying in radically different manners. So this is my approach to language, which is like undoing the sacred field of language as a self-referential, universe of meaning production. So it's interesting how in nonverbal communication studies there is a certain consensus around the fact that in such a situation as this, any kind of interpersonal communication process, like 93% of what's going on is nonverbal, and 7% roughly would be reducible to language, whatever that is, grammar, structures, and I don't know. I think I would even take it further, but
that's interesting because you spoke about the software and the beta, and if that refers to code, I think you were mentioning, or the term glitch comes to mind when the code is having a problem, And again, I think it's interesting to think of code and what is that, What kind of language is that, and can it also be thought of as a non-verbal and non-mathematical language when you build in these glitches?
No, well, it's the interesting thing about software. There are many, many interesting issues. For instance, how software always exceeds the purpose for which it was made in the ways in which it can produce uncanny, unexpected effects, like mathematics itself, for example. So the weirdness in code and in mathematics, in algorithms. On the other hand, of course, there's a very problematic way in which code is conceived and thought of as something disembodied. Again, coming back to the initial questions I was posing, which Catherine Hales has extensively criticized, and other feminist thinkers, of this pervasive attempt to erase corporeality in media culture, in digital media, and much in many other areas of our humanistic tradition also. But even in writing, there is this attempt, I think, and in this conception of language as something related to the rational mind, which is why I think it's so important to rethink language within the body in a much broader sense, and never reduced to whatever mind processes. So again, code, I think, is very problematically conceived and thought of as a disembodied process, like information also. I think we have to rethink code radically, which is why, well, of course, this was more of a parodic project, but this idea of rethinking code in terms of bodily code, which is not working, of course.
Bodily software,
yeah, bodily software. I think is something one could go much deeper into in many ways, because I think it's absolutely problematic and possibly wrong to think that code can ever be a completely disembodied thing that acts as a writing which is purely abstract. I think, of course, code is always structuring matter and bodies, but I prefer to think of bodies not so much in terms of matter and understand more the relationalities that are structuring the bodies. So there is where I would revisit code in terms of trying to understand what kinds of relationalities and affects code is maybe iterating or structuring, and maybe also what is escaping from that process. So maybe my approach to code would be, again, from a meta-humanistic point of view, so to see it from a relational perspective, and certainly not from the way in which it is traditionally envisioned.
Thank you for Fiona, and then Alice Hansen.
I have a couple of questions. One when you were saying that towards the end of the painting, that the idea was to produce the unintelligible, but that it didn't work. But how would you know that you didn't produce the unintelligible?
Well, of course, yeah, it's a very good question again, and yeah, it's subject to ongoing critique. We never know what. In fact, we can. I think very often it's impossible to distinguish or to know whether we are producing meaning. Which, in fact, if I don't believe in meaning, we are never quite intelligible, which is my starting point. So even when we think that we are producing intelligible meaning, I think that even there we are more embedded in a process of affective dissemination in which everybody involved in that process will be producing differential proliferations of those affects. So that's why each of you is possibly focusing on radically different aspects of my talk and thinking about them differently and taking different ideas back home and making something completely different out of. So, you know, whenever I talk or whenever anybody talks in front of an audience, even if it's, you know, 10,000 or 500 or whatever, I'm absolutely certain that every single person sitting there is having completely different potential interpretations of what's going on. And you often realize this through the questions people ask, or, you know, or even when you're having a conversation with someone, you know, for hours, and then towards the end of the conversation I realize sometimes suddenly that the other person had not understood anything of what I wanted to say. Has this not occurred to you? Even if it is a close friend or, you know, a colleague who's sharing many of your own frameworks of interpretation. So I think this shows, in a way, for me, some of these problems, and I think for me the approach to them is not like from a Derridean point of view from language and from the gaps and problems within the structures of language, but rather because language is an embodied process and never a purely abstract one. I don't know if that was a clear answer. Did I answer your question?
At the beginning.
Sorry, at the beginning?
Yeah, no, went somewhere else. It was interesting.
Okay.
But my question was about the spectacular nature of the performance, of seeing you in your cyborg form, as opposed to the anti-spectacular nature of the project. And yes, that raises a lot of questions.
Yeah.
One also being that the camera is the body seeing, but you project onto an external object. So why not find an equivalent to the an equivalently questioning version of the projected screen?
That's an excellent question. I've thought about this quite often, actually. Well, regarding the spectacular in the performance, I think it even came out yesterday, and not in these terms. That's one of the reasons why I'm trying to do away with the audience, to avoid the spectacular element of this physical cyborgish body. Of course, in these which you have seen, it is very evident that there is a spectacular element which for me is also problematic, and which I'm trying to rethink. Here it becomes doubly or twice more spectacular because you are watching a documentary of something which was in itself a bit more immersive and a different kind of experience. So, of course, that's another problem of showing a documentary of a process or of a work that is experienced in a different manner. And sorry, the last part of the question was
About the
Projection.
the projection. Yeah. Well, of course, yeah. Yeah, I am also quite concerned with the flat walls. I don't like them, actually. I often, well, I found little ways of doing away with it. Sometimes, for example, when I project in the streets, I never have like a rectangular projection, but it's a blurred projection with blurred borders and a bit more amorphous or a round projection, which of course is moving all the time. So there in the street project, it's a bit less spectacular regarding the flatness of the screen and the squareness of the screen.
But projection there must be, because yesterday when I was asking, what do you want the performer to look into the image that she is creating, you said yes, it must be seen.
But it could be seen through other means. So as I was suggesting, I want to start using, I haven't yet used, but I want to start using virtual glasses so that the projection is not on a wall, but it's actually, I don't have to be looking at a wall, and there is not this architectural element of the rectangular screen, but I am completely immersed in the image and I can move around, and I'm really closed in this circuit of production of the body.
It's still a visual immersion that's privileging sight rather than, let's say, multisensory oral immersiveness.
Well, of course, yeah, because in these projects I'm interested in reappropriating vision in a way. So, but the fact is that when you transform vision, the other senses are also transformed, because senses are never independent from one another. This is one of the key things that are put forward in contemporary cognitive sciences or in active cognition, whatever, the multimodal character of perception. So this is contradictory with our tradition. Our humanistic tradition says we have 5 senses and they are all independent. This is why we have, the School of Arts, the School of Music, and so on and so forth. And this is all, I was going to say bullshit. Well, this is all not really true. Senses are actually always working in cross-modal interactions between one another. So, synesthesia, rather than being an illness as it had been pathologized in the 20th century, it is actually the common thing. Perhaps not in such intense manners as some people experience it, but the fact that you associate sensory inputs is what's happening all the time. So if you transform one kind of input, the others are also shifting. And here also we have the oral feedback, in which your processing of your voice is also transforming the oral awareness, especially because in the installation performances the sound is spatialized in at least 4 channels, so it's moving around you. It's never a stereo. I don't, just as I don't like stages and screens, I don't like stereo systems, which is again an architecture of for centralizing perception. I think we have to work a lot around decentering perception at all levels. So, of course, it's interesting to work on other senses and reinvent other senses. In these projects, I was interested in redefining vision, and I think when you do that, also the other senses shift, possibly.
Thank you. Alison?
Was
there one before Alison?
I was also going to pick up on the question of meaning and the very honourable attempt to escape meaning, but I am really interested in that relationship between affect and meaning, and that affect is not outside of meaning either, even though it works very differently from emotion, and that might be disseminating its meaning in different ways. But even, looking back at a Massumian kind of idea,
Massumian, yeah.
That the autonomy of is in the end ultimately not separate, but it's that backward referral.
It's that.
His idea of the backward referral in time, so that in retrospect, and not sort of at the end of it all, but in constantly we're backwardly referring in time, and we will be making our meaning. So that yes, if it's working effectively rather than emotionally, we might be sitting on many, many different, as you said, we're all guessing effects, and we will then produce something, but we do produce something because that is, as we go wild, our meaning makes us backwardly go wild. So, what I would say is that I find the work very, very interesting, and I like throughout your sense that it fails, because ultimately everybody will attempt to do something with it, whether they like their hands on it in frustration and drop their arms, I can't make any meaning, so it's devoid of that.
Sorry, the last thing.
So that whether somebody is utterly frustrated by the attempts, the futility of trying to make meaning, and they just give up, and maybe then there is a sort of success in that attempt to escape. But I guess I'm just throwing it up as that kind of the failure ever to escape meaning.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question. Maybe my frustration will be in not being able to produce meaninglessness rather than meaning. Yeah. So that will be my frustration. But no, of course, yeah, it's a crucial.
I admire the attempt. I think it's a great step towards it.
But is it true that we always produce meaning? Aren't we attracted to something that we don't understand?
But we still work to make sense.
Well, I think it's a very...
It was not my experience yesterday. There were many moments yesterday when I'm looking at the post-anatomies that our dancers created, where I had no clue what I was looking at. I mean, I could guess it was skin, yeah, but I couldn't understand what it was in terms of shape, form, and identity. So I was happy with that.
But that's not the same as meaning.
But if you're producing, if you're...
Okay, what is meaning then for you, Alison? Meaning?
I suppose meaning would be some sort of framework that allows you to
interpret. But that's what maybe Johannes wasn't needing in that occasion,
Need that.
even.
Also the issue of masculinity, femininity, sex. It was very interesting at the last duet between Angeliki and Yoko. It was really, really interesting. That a number of things didn't really function, yeah, for me in terms of reading two women or reading two female bodies. It didn't matter because I was attracted to something else on the screen. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, no, I think it's a crucial question, of course, since I'm interested in questioning meaning production machines of culture. So I try to be careful in not fantasizing too much of how one can escape. Of course, I'm never a utopian, as I said before. I think I always think of these as little resistance strategies that we can exercise in our daily lives, never in terms of getting rid forever of whatever. Still, I think that the paradigm of meaning production is one paradigm amongst a million. Only we are very immersed in it, so for us it's very difficult to escape, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to have a livable life and an interesting culture which doesn't have to do at all with meaning production. I'm convinced that this would be possible. And I'm convinced also that many of our experiences in daily life don't go through meaning production. I think we already have this. As I was saying before, when you are sitting in front of the sea and watching this, I always say this because I think it's something that most people have sometimes done. You sit in front of the sea and you get lost in the amorphous movement of the waves for hours, or looking at the sunset and the amorphous movement of the clouds, or looking at the trees and the movement of the leaves in the wind. Okay, this kind of experience. I think mostly, of course, there's always people who project forms into these and say, I see a rabbit and I see one. But I think sometimes that's not the case, and in these kinds of experiences, I think for me it's quite clear that it's not about interpreting so much, but about becoming with. It's more of an immanent becoming with. It's quite microsexual in that respect, or microdancey, because it's about this becoming with something to which you are suddenly not exterior. You are not trying to position yourself as external to it, to interpret it. So I think we do this already. And as I say, also there are other techniques, older techniques in dance and in other fields of cultural production that have produced other technologies for these purposes. Just in my context, I try to develop certain specific things, and each of you could develop others. So I do think that it's possible to have certain degrees of escape, although I am aware that one must be very careful not to pretend that one can escape forever if one is embedded, as we are, in these machines of meaning production that are so resilient.
The widening of amorphousness, of course, would cause the collapse of the social order. You realize that?
Of course. Well, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Well, I don't know. This could link. Maybe if you want, I don't know if you want that we talk about this today or tomorrow about these social movements and
the gender strike
or gender strike and other things. I'm very involved in the different Occupy movements. We have had one in Madrid since 15th May, which has actually, according to some people, launched the other Occupy movements in the world right now. And we have various groups. I'm involved in various groups working there. Of course, it's not always there about pure anarchy. There's many more reformist, or whatever you call it, kinds of proposals about reformation of the system rather than a revolutionary approach.
Promoting public intimacy and
public sex. Well, no. We have this transvagdyke assembly in the Occupy Madrid movement. So the queer assembly, so to speak, which is actually more even post-queer, I would say, because, I promote some of these issues, and we have the gender strike, and which, as I say, is the legitimate rejection of binary gender categories, which you can perform in many different ways, from refusing to fill in forms where you have to put the gender category, to entering the wrong toilet, so to speak, to putting reports and claims in international courts or national courts, claiming that it disappears from your identity card. to subverting your daily behaviors, but not so much in the sense of taking the behaviors of the other binary gender, but maybe of producing something that is more unintelligible, and so on and so forth. So that's something we launched for this October, because in October there was the October Trans, so there's this global campaign against the it's STP, Stop Trans Pathologization. As you may know, transsexuality is still considered a pathology, so there's a global campaign to fight against this. And so during the month of October we did some activities regarding that. But then of course there are other groups in which I'm involved, more regarding economy or ecology and other issues, where we are proposing other kinds of things. And well, I think that it's important to be very pluralistic regarding politics. So I think that there's room for being at the same time, or having at the same time, strategies that are more to do with, have more to do with resistance, other strategies that are more maybe revolutionary and utopian in a way, others that are more to do with speaking to the system and claiming that certain laws are changed, and so on. So I think that we can have many levels that are compatible at the same time, even if they may even look contradictory, because we're used to having or assuming this humanistic concept of being a homogeneous being, but I think we are not. And this is what post-humanist critique says, amongst many other things. We are heterogeneous beings in heterogeneous and changing worlds, so we have to have also heterogeneous perspectives and multiple perspectives. So what I propose in some of these projects is more of a lack of perspective and immanence, and not being exterior to. But this is compatible, I think, with having multiple partial perspectives within the immanence, which means we are never completely exterior to the relational processes in which we are constituted. But within this, because there are many strata and many processes inside the processes, we can have different degrees of perspective within the immanence. So this can account for having at the same time strategies of amorphous becomings, together with politics in which you go and do a demonstration and claim, you know, whatever from the government, which could seem contradictory, but I think it's complementary. So in these movements, some of us are trying to promote this kind of pluralism where you can have living together of anarchist approach with more whatever. But yes, of course, a deep criticism of these fundamental categories of identification, of form, of binaries, and so on, would imply certainly a complete and deep transformation of all the structures we are immersed in, but especially not from an ideological point of view. If we can't change anything if we remain only in an ideological view. We have to change the technologies, the aesthetics, the languages, the architectures, the choreographies. If we don't change radically any of these, or deeply, if we don't work deeply on any of these, I don't think it's going to change. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why some of the movements in the past failed a little bit, because they remained just on a level of ideology and so on, whereas they and especially also many of them failed because they didn't consider very seriously any issues regarding, for example, sexuality or issues like that. So they always were clinging to respectability, many of the revolutionary movements, in the aspect of sexuality. So yeah, in this Transflag Assembly we claim lots of things which are not usually in the agenda of queer movements, and which go far beyond equality, things like that. So we challenge or question binary identities, not only in gender and sex, but even in sexual orientation, because of course, if you think the traditional sexual orientation categories like heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, well, their condition of possibility is also a binary gender identity, and to reduce desire to the binary gender identity of the other person. But if you don't have a stable binary gender identity, then you can't think of yourself as neither of these, And then if you furthermore explore that your desire doesn't necessarily have to do with the gender identity of another person, but with parts of bodies, or with practices, or with other species, or with objects, or so on and so forth, then you could invent, of course, a catalogue, a never-ending catalogue of 100,027 sexual orientations, of which you would tick like 25 every day. Do we want to do this? Or, you know, or this is why I speak sometimes of rather working on techniques for sexual disorientation. And of course the Microsexes project is one such technique for sexually and productively disorienting affects. This issue of disorientation...
We succeeded last night. Half of our
Good.
group was disoriented
Good.
until late in the night.
Oh,
Yeah,
excellent.
we went to the, remember? Yeah, I could feel it. Yeah.
Oh, you tell me
This
later.
is good, yes. We don't want to overstretch obviously your patience, so I think I'm going to ask for a final question, but open to all of you who would like to come back tomorrow morning in my mise en scène seminar, which takes place in here. Jaime will come as guest, and we will be here from 10 o'clock till 1 o'clock, so it is another opportunity for you to engage in conversation.
And I think we will deepen on the sexuality politics thing.
Maybe also this issue of occupation, and as a, I don't know what you, political, aesthetic, performative strategy would interest me a lot. Notion of squatting, I tried to once write about it and I didn't really succeed. The notion of squatting as a performance, Any last comments, questions from the floor, please? Welcome. Time for one more. Yes.
I just heard that you mentioned that you are more or less political activists, so you are interacting with movements you're coming from Spain, right?
Yeah.
I think that you probably have already heard that there is occupation in London.
I've been there today, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. In fact, as I was saying, we've had the Occupy Madrid movement since 15th May. There was a very large movement in the whole of Spain from that moment, and that started to spread later in other countries and so on. Of course, before that we also had the Arab movements and the Iceland and so on. So I don't pretend, of course, that we started it in Spain in any way. But this particular kind of occupation of the streets, we've had it very, very intensely in Spain since May. It's been quite an unprecedented experience for all of us there. Yeah, maybe tomorrow we can talk more about this, but yeah, but I mean, I've been for years involved in activism of different kinds, mostly in two specific realms. One is not only ecology, but specifically the problem of land speculation, which in Spain has been very, very extraordinary, and then on the sex, gender issues also. Just to finish a sentence maybe of this whole set of things that we propose in the Transvectaic Assembly. So sexual disorientation and how microsexes and these techniques can work as techniques for sexual disorientation. Sarah Ahmed, in her book Queer Phenomenology, talks about the possibilities or the need maybe for a politics of disorientation. So there are other people interested in this, and so we also wanted to challenge other kinds of sexual norms, which are, I think, also quite arbitrary and quite constitutive of the kind of social and sexual order that we inhabit. For instance, the condemnation of sexuality to the closet of intimacy, therefore public sex, the obligatory monogamy of the relationships, and therefore polyamoria or multigamy, not polygamy, which is a more hierarchical kind of thing, but so having multiple partners with the consent and knowledge of all of them and so on. And well, all of these binaries and constructs we try to work against in various manners. Of course, in that context, it's more traditional politics of, claiming certain things and so on. But I think there are also more experimental ways of dealing with these. And in my projects, I try to address that from a more, I would call it laboratory politics. So it's not something that you can maybe take now out into the streets, but it's experimenting with limits and possibilities in other kinds of ways.
Testing,
prototyping. Prototyping for beta meta-humans.
Thank you very much, Jaime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. And we will make the lecture available on archive on dancetechNet, so it can be reviewed. Yeah. Thanks very much
Thank you.
for your presentation.